We got to get down to some of the basics on the labor market and get those out of the way. We set the stage for you last time and defined a downward sloping labor demand curve and an upward sloping labor supply curve. And the fun begins when we start talking about changes in them. If it didn't begin already, but it gets even more intense, the fun that is, gets more intense as we start to talk about the shifters. So remember, this is one labor market, one market of four that we're going to try to use to explain the world a little bit better. First of all, note that we're measuring labor hours along the horizontal axis. And this is the real wage on the vertical axis. So I like to point that out because it's not the number of human beings. Back in the last chapter when we did the unemployment rate, it's the number of humans that are not working that want to work. Here, we're looking at the number of hours being worked. So it's not, that variable tends to move in a similar direction as employment, but it's not the same variable. All right, so we've got a labor demand curve that's downward sloping due to the diminishing marginal product of labor. We've got a labor supply curve by households that's upward sloping, meaning that as households, as a particular person even works more and more hours, they need an increasing wage to offset their increasing cost of the scarce time left over in the day. And so those are the two forces at hand as we look at the labor force on determining some sort of equilibrium wage and number of hours worked in the United States. Okay, so we're just going to list these as something to memorize here for this material. Labor supply shifters. Number one, changes in the working age population. This was a variable we looked at in chapter 5 called the WAP, the working age population. So if there's an increase in WAP, how does that impact the supply of labor? Does it tend to increase the supply of labor or decrease it? Increase, right? So if the equilibrium wage was, I don't know, $15, at $15, there used to be this many hours worked. Maybe it's 100, just to make up a number here. But now at $15, given that the population has grown, there's this many people willing to work. At $20 an hour, there used to be this many people that would come to work. Now there's this many people that want to come to work. At $7 an hour, $7.50 an hour, there used to be this many people that wanted to come to work, and now there's this many people that want to come to work. Just from a sheer numbers standpoint, right? The population has grown, and so that supply curve has relocated itself to the right. So an increase in the working age population leads to an increase in the labor supply curve, a shift to the right. Now this is one of the first times I think that we've started to get into the dynamics of the supply and demand model with shifting. I guess we maybe did a little bit of it in the international chapter. But I'll try to keep working you through in that way to understand what's going on. Now the prediction part. The working age population increased, what happened to the variables at hand? What happened to the real wage? The wage went down. So now we look at our horizontal and vertical axis to look at the impact of that movement. Working age population increased. We moved along the labor demand curve to a lower wage. Let's just say, just to kind of make up some numbers here, to $13. So wages came down, real wages came down, and more people are working, or not necessarily more people again, but more hours are being worked. And then we're done. So in a sense, we move from A to point B. From A to B. So this leads to a decrease in the real wage and an increase in hours. All right, that's the only one we're going to have for labor supply. Labor demand. Labor demand shifters. Number one, a change in technology. So an increase, let's call it, in technology, and I'll talk about that for a moment. An increase in technology. Does all technological change lead to businesses hiring more workers? No. So there's kind of multiple things going on with that statement that we got to think back maybe a little bit to the production possibilities frontier. And when let's say a technology replaces labor, it's some sort of labor saving type thing, that causes workers to migrate to different positions, right? So if they end up having a reduction in the demand for labor in one position, then they go find another job. So there might be a transition, but the amount of labor that's out there in terms of the working age population is still there. And so as we look at the what economists would call a general equilibrium picture of taking into consideration all of the effects, a change in technology would eventually lead to labor overall being more productive. Because if I've invented a machine that allows a person and a machine to cut more lawns, let's say, if we go back to the lawnmower example, then I can afford to pay that person more money by utilizing that machine. Again, a short-term effect might be that some people lose their job. If I had 3 guys with 3 sickles, right, my Mexican example that I saw when I was your guys' age down in Mexico, and that's how the lawn got mowed. We have a new machine come along and I only need to retain one of those guys. There's 2 guys freed up. But the wage that I can pay the guy who's going to be cutting the lawn has actually gone up. And so as we transition and think about the entire labor force, technology, an increase in technology leads to an increase in labor demand. And I'll make a comment here on what I just said. So, note, if technology replaces labor in one industry, it still allows employer to pay more to the workers left behind. A machine increases the marginal product of labor. Because this one's always a little bit difficult to try to work through. And the same is true for our next one that's coming up. And that is a change in the amount of machines. So shifter number 2 works very similar. A change in the capital stock, a change in capital. So when we think about the K, this is the capital bucket or the capital stock. The number of machines, the number of buildings, the number of things that help make other things. If we increase the amount of machines, that will allow our workforce to be more productive. So an increase in capital leads to an increase in the productivity of labor, which increases labor demand. A shift to the right. So I'll do this the whole semester, by the way. I'll try to put a few reminders since it's early in the semester right now, but an up arrow of whatever follows means a shift to the right. A down arrow means shift to the left in terms of what's going on with the curve. All right, and then the last one is probably the one that's especially relevant for this chapter, and that is an increase in human capital. An increase in human capital. What's the concept of human capital?
Your skill in certain whatever you need to be doing.
Okay, good. So it's the skill that you have, right? Your education level, whatever you are, you're different than another person. One person who's more skilled in that area has more human capital, is what the economist would say. Likewise, people can develop their skills by educating themselves. Not necessarily going to a 4-year institution. They might go to high school for starters, right? They might go to some on-the-job training program. They might go out and get a certificate on learning how to become a certified financial planner or something. So there's lots of different ways to educate yourself. So this is very generic in terms of its application. And an increase in human capital from, again, this is macroeconomics, so we're thinking about our island we live on. If there's a general uptick in human capital, that's going to make those people more productive, and that'll lead to an increase in the demand for labor. More productive people get paid more in general. So, what's the equilibrium effect of that? As human capital goes up, physical capital goes up, technology advances, what happens here with our graph? Marshawn? They're going to move to the right, and so what's going to happen with our variables? It's going to shift up, right? So these variables are going to go up, right? So there's going to be an upward march of the real wage along, assuming that nothing else changes with the population, we'd start to move along this one. So if I envision labor demand going up over time, as we continue to get a more educated society, as we start to accumulate physical capital, this is the direction. And this is really embodying economic growth so that we get those real GDP per person statistics going up like we saw. Right? That's where I started this section off with, is looking at the pay per person. Well, that's kind of the real wage, right? The wage per hour paid to somebody who's doing some work. We start to see the shift of the labor demand curve marching off to the right. And so a shift to the right for these reasons would lead to increases, maybe getting us up to point C and having prosperity in terms of the real wage climb. All right. Questions or comments on that? Okay, so I fussed a little bit about the real wage last time, and I want to think about that a little bit more. What did the real wage capture? If that was a test question for you, which it very well could be, what does the real wage capture? What does it mean that it's the real wage?
It's how much you can buy given the current prices with your income.
Okay, given the current prices, how much you can actually buy, right? So it shows the quantity of goods. So we went through the hamburger example. How many hamburgers can you buy with your $15 an hour pay versus what you could last year or the year before? And so the analysis we did was over time. We took away the inflation effect to calculate the real wage. And what I want to do for a little bit here is show you some data on how important it is to look at the real wage in different parts of the country. What would you rather have, a $50,000 a year job in Kansas City or a $50,000 a year job in Los Angeles?
Kansas City.
Kansas City, right? So this is cost of living. Now, the difference here is that we're looking at a slice in time. The real wage that we did before took into account price adjustments over time. So if I look at 2014, 2013, 2012, right? I look at what the real wage looks like over time. Here we're going to look at what it looks like at a slice in time, but in different places of the world. Well, not the world. I'm going to look at the United States. And I don't know what that is. This was some old data that I had. Des Moines just hit, as most of you know, I'm from Ames, Iowa, and so I've got some ties still to, not originally from there, but where I was last time. And Des Moines, Iowa ended up being one of the top places to live in terms of pay, median adjusted pay. So it was #1 in the nation. This was back in 2009, and it's persisted strongly. I can't remember exactly what it would be today, but I know they made the news again within the last month or so. And what this is saying is that if the median household income in Des Moines is $56,000, right? So if you live in Des Moines, the middle person, if we take all the Des Moinesians and we line them up, the middle person's making $56,000. So down here in Los Angeles, Long Beach, Glendale, California area, again, if I line up all the LA people from highest paid to lowest paid, the middle person is earning $58,000. So pretty close to the Des Moines pay is my point, right? We're taking the middle person within that area. But in terms of purchasing power, because of the cost of living being higher in LA, $58,000 buys you $41,000 worth of stuff. Purchasing power again. I go to the store, what does it buy me? I rent an apartment, what does it buy me? Holding all that stuff constant, they get $41,000 worth of stuff, whereas the Des Moinesian up here gets $62,000 worth of stuff. That's a $20,000 swing. So it can be a big deal in terms of your purchasing power to look at the cost of living. So as you guys enter the job market after you're leaving here, if you're thinking about going to work for your nearby your hometown, and that's in Colorado or that's in California or that's wherever, you can jump online and look at cost of living adjustment. And there's a couple other websites that you can use. But if you just Google cost of living adjustment, you can check out what the difference is. Instead of having this particular piece came from a specific data source, an article that did a little thing on it. All right, questions or comments on that? Okay, so I wanted to bring that as a little additional wrinkle to think about purchasing power. Oh shoot, maybe I did want to. Yeah, maybe dropping that sucker down again. Sorry. There's one other thing I wanted to show you. Come on, we're going to give this thing a workout. This is straight out of your textbook. And it kind of plays into the economic freedom stuff that we looked at last time with the Freedom of the World Index in different countries. This guy is a famous international economist, Xavier Saleh-Martin, and he kind of compiled all the economic studies on why do countries grow, what's some of the important things that we need to have. So this column says good for economic growth, bad for economic growth. So up at the top, we've got the region. Farther from the equator seems to be good. Politics, the rule of law versus revolutions. Does anybody know what the rule of law means? In terms of politics now, the rule of law.
How much we acknowledge established laws and how we go about things.
Yeah, that's part of it. So the way I kind of got onto this was to think of, do you want to be ruled by men or women? Or do you want to be ruled by law? What would you prefer? If you were setting up an economy and thinking about how history has played out, would you prefer to be ruled by people or ruled by law? Law. Why?
People are corrupt sometimes.
They can be corrupt. They can be very good-hearted too, but they can be corrupt, right? So if we look at history, how was the world governed over the last 2,000 to 4,000 years? What was the setup of the island? Kings, monarchies, right? So we had kings and queens and rulers of the land. They owned everything. Everybody else owned nothing. I mean, that's the setup. Was I own everything, you own nothing. That was the way it was set up. And so when our founding fathers of this particular country that we're in said, you know what, there's a pretty good history of countries getting screwed up and being ruled by people at kind of their own discretion and changing rules, and that just didn't seem like a very good idea. And so they came up with the Constitution and said, let's let the land be ruled by law, in writing, transparent, everybody knows how it works. And of course we still have elected officials, but they are there to help carry out the law. And eventually, in some cases, they might change the law as things go. But in general, the land is ruled by the law. And so that's part of what our Constitution brings to the table in the United States, is the rule of law. And what this economist has studied is that countries that in general have more rule of law rather than rule of people tend to work out better for economic growth. Civil liberties, economic system, capitalism has been the best so far in terms of economic growth. So the communist regime, you guys have heard about the wall, the Great Wall or not the Great Wall, I was about to say the Great Wall of China, but that one's kind of coming down, so to speak, in a sense, but not down the way the German wall, East Germany, West Germany, right? All of those regimes have tended to lead to situations that weren't so hot. Venezuela has had more of a dictator-style thing going for a while. I just heard on the news the other day where their inflation rate is at. What's the inflation rate in the United States currently, roughly?
I want to say
7, 3 or 4, 12, 10. There's probably some debate out there, but if you believe the Federal Reserve, which is kind of a different question, but 2 to 3% has been really what we've been traditionally even. And so most data would support that we're still in this 2 to 3% range. Venezuela, 56%.
Oh.
56%. So if you, let's think about what that feels like in Venezuela when it's 56%. So if you go to the store and you buy yourself a Mountain Dew for $2, and you go back a month later, what does it run you? If you go back a year later, what would it be? $3 roughly, right? So $3. So that thing had climbed $1 over the course of a year. So let's just say roughly 10 cents, right? So this prices of goods are climbing on the shelves at a remarkable pace, and unfortunately, there's a chance that that could go way higher. So there's been cases throughout history of what economists call hyperinflation, and you can get into 50% a month. There's been a number of places. Post-war Germany, Argentina's in a mess right now. Again, they had a mess in the past. Brazil, Zimbabwe is another fun one to look at. Fun from an academic standpoint, not so fun for the country itself. Let's see, where's my Zimbabwe? Maybe I'll save that one for later. But Zimbabwe's been kind of a mess with this hyperinflation. And you can imagine the instability that it creates, right, in terms of decisions. If we get back to capitalism, which is just pro-trade, what else is capitalism to you? When you hear the word capitalism, what are some things that stick out? Let's just have kind of a rapid fire. What do you think? Money. So capitalism. Money. What else? Competition. What else? Markets. What else? Trade.
Market prices.
Prices. Market prices. What else?
Would labor be
Labor? Sure. Honestly, there's no wrong answers. I'm just asking you, when the word capitalism comes into your mind, what are some things that come out? Corporations. Anything else? All right, so if you have a capitalist society, do you have to be pro-business? So we got corporations, business. Nobody mentioned people. That would be probably a good one. Do you have to be pro-business if you're a pro-capitalist? pro-capitalist pro-business, or are all pro-business pro-capitalist? Okay, what do you think? Why do you say that? He said it depends on your definition of business.
Private businesses or jobs for corporations.
Okay, so small business versus big business, maybe? Okay. And why do you say it depends on, what do you mean?
Well, because there are a lot of people who are for small business and local businesses, not for large corporations.
Okay, some people might be pro-small business rather than pro-big business. So are pro-business people always pro-capitalist? What on this list, from what we've done so far, and so I know some of you have had micro, what is the key feature of these bullets that you guys came up with for capitalism?
The exchange.
The exchange, I'd agree that's right there at the top, which we didn't put. Trade. Okay, we got trade. Now that would be, pro-business would be pro-trade, pro-exchange. What else is a key ingredient?
Competition,
Competition. Why do you say that?
because that's what really helps capitalism flourish in my mind. It creates an environment where, because you have several people competing, then everyone tries to create the best product so that they buy what they're selling, as opposed to just anything.
Okay, I totally agree. So competition would probably be right up at the top of the list. So I'd even probably want to put these two things together. Competition in trade, competition in exchange. So are all pro-business people pro-capitalist? What do businesses a lot of times try to do? Think about some businesses. What do you can just imagine some of their businesses? What's that? Kill small business. That'd be one. Make money. Merge to get bigger, right? To be more powerful. What about with government? What might bigger business have the greater ability to do as opposed to small business with government? Put money in their pockets, get favors thrown out to them, right? So a lot of big business people, or pro-business people, I should say, are actually anti-capitalist in a way. Because they're not out there promoting competition. Competition's one of the key ingredients. They're more looking for a handout. They're more looking for a little easy way through the system. And so oftentimes, pro-business people aren't pro-capitalist. So if you're anti-big business, then it's okay to be a capitalist. I just want to help you kind of refine your thinking on what capitalism is and what it means for the economy. It means more of this, and what we've learned are the good things, one being economic growth, that comes out of that type of system. And in fact, big business tied to big government is completely anti-capitalist. That's not the type of system that capitalism really promotes. Okay. What else we got here? So we got human capital, investment, physical capital, open to trade. All right. So, any other questions or comments there? All right, so we got 3 growth theories that we're going to kind of lay out. That was kind of a summary of the findings of these different theories. The first one was what we call classical theory on economic growth. And it was a little bit, so 3 theories on economic growth. So first of all, economic growth means growth of what? should have that down before we even start this discussion. Growth of what? Real GDP, good. Our GDP. Real GDP is our economic growth factor. The number of stuff that we have, right? Not so much the dollar value, as long as it's what those dollars buy, even though it ends up being the nation's income, as we've learned. But we're really looking at changes in real prosperity. So, number one is the classical growth theory. This is the earliest one. And here's what they came up with. This is old school now. Prosperity leads to babies. You're doing good, you crank out some more kids. Prosperity leads to babies. So what happens to your real well-being per person if that's your outlook on growth? It could potentially go down or maybe at best stay flat, right? So if we think about our growth variable, real GDP, divided by the population, we've got two things going on. We have growth, but then we kick out more kids. We got these two things competing with each other and offsetting each other. And so population growth offsets technological and capital growth. Real GDP growth. And this is where economics got coined the dismal science. The dismal science. It's kind of depressing to think that, oh, we're doing good, but we're never going to be good. We're never going to get that well off. Well, a lot of this went away. So the early growth theorists put this together in the 1800s. So imagine Adam Smith wrote his seminal piece in 1776. David Ricardo comes along. There's some other economists that start looking at growth. They take a look at the data from Jesus to the 1800s, and guess what real GDP per person looks like? We've been poor. We've been poor for 2,000 years. And so as we start to grow and we get a little bit better, the population is going to continue to make that look that way. And so we've just had 2,000 years of the average person worldwide, again, ignoring the kings and queens and the monarchs that were there. We have economic growth per person that looks like that. And for the most part, we're all poor, relatively speaking. Industrial Revolution comes along, some of the things Adam Smith kicks in, and all of a sudden we start to get what we call the hockey stick in economic growth. We get this boom that goes on, especially in the United States. And that leads us to growth theory number 2, the neoclassical growth. Neoclassical growth theory. And here, increase in technology leads to increase in savings and investment, which we're going to talk a lot more about next chapter. Savings and investment leads to an increase in our capital bucket. More machines, more buildings, industrial revolution, making our labor more productive, and therefore leading to an increase in real GDP per person, which is our hockey stick. If this is real GDP per person, per capita, PC. Now, the rub on this was that this is subject to diminishing returns. Remember diminishing returns? We talked about that last time. So as we acquire more and more capital, it doesn't keep giving us this extra bump, maybe an exponential bump in growth. So one thing to note here is that we still have diminishing returns to growth. Because of diminishing returns to capital and to the resources that are growing. Okay. So this is really physical capital, neoclassical growth. The most modern growth theory is new growth theory. Yeah, I got neo and then you got new, so we didn't want to go neo again and have that confusion. So new growth theorists, they argue that there are that growth, put that back here, sorry. Growth is not necessarily subject to diminishing returns. Diminishing returns. So the focus here is on human capital. How do we increase human capital again? Education, training, innovation, change, right? We start to get more and more of that going on. And that creates knowledge. So how they get this result is that education, training, / knowledge in general is not subject to diminishing returns the same way that physical capital is their argument. Okay, so to motivate this a little bit more, I want to draw the production function. Real GDP on the vertical axis, labor on the horizontal. This is the first graph I put on the board before. Remember, it had a shape that looked like this. And so our production function looks like this. There's the diminishing returns. As I add more and more labor with a fixed amount of capital, the returns I get from each successive increase are falling at the margin. And so one thing to maybe note is that this is for capital at a fixed level, right? For a given level of capital, and technology, whatever that is, whatever we want to think about that being. If I drew a picture with capital down here on the horizontal axis, it would look the same. But now labor would be the thing that would be moving. That's neoclassical growth theory. That we can have growth as we increase more capital, then there's going to be diminishing returns, holding labor constant. So what happens when we have a technological shock or a change in innovation? What happens to this production function? Where does it go from here? How does it move? What do you see happening here? Change in technology and innovation, something new. Surge up, right? So we can think about this many units of labor, L1, used to produce this much GDP. Now that we have this new wham bam awesome way of doing it, we can get that much. So technology ends up shifting the production production function up. And let me step back and ask you, is technology changing at a very slow pace or a rapid pace? Rapid, right? I mean, we just kind of know that there's always new things coming in, and that's another angle to this theory here, is that if the economy's being continually shocked all the time with new innovations, new technology, new ways of doing things, then we can envision that there's a movement upward of this production function that looks like this. And it's very possible that if we checked out 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, and if we map out the actual economy, we don't have diminishing returns. That's the new growth theory. As long as we're continually innovating and changing and surging upward, the path of the economy might look like that. So that's the new growth theory path. And it is not subject to diminishing returns. All right, we'll call it a day there. We'll see you on the next day. What day is it today? Monday? Wednesday.